The years from 1958 to 1962 brought an unprecedented string of East-West confrontations, several of which involved nuclear brinkmanship. Khrushchev initiated the next major Cold War crisis, in part to counter charges that the Soviets had grown weak and vacillating through the West. In June 1961, the Soviet leader rekindled the flames of the simmering Berlin crisis during a tense meeting with the new US President John F. Kennedy at Vienna. He blustered that if the US wanted to go to war over Berlin, there was nothing the USSR could do about it. History will be the judge of our actions. But the most worrisome area of all for the US at that time proved the island nation of Cuba, lying just 90 miles off the southern tip of Florida. In 1959, Fidel Castro, a Cuban leader, launched an ambitious revolutionary program designed to free Cuba from its historic economic and political dependence on the US. Castro turned to the Soviet Union, welcoming its diplomatic and economic support. Eisenhower administration imposed a trade embargo on Cuba, suspended Cuban sugar's favored access to the US market, and hatched plots through the CIA to assassinate Castro. The October Crisis, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, as it is more commonly known, constituted the most dangerous Soviet-US confrontation of the entire Cold War, the one in which the two superpowers and the world came closest to the devastation of nuclear war. The crisis broke on 14th October 1962, when a U-2 reconnaissance plane photographed some intermediate-range missile sites under construction in Cuba. Those images offered an alarming picture. Cuba had already received between 16 and 32 missiles from the Soviet Union, both intermediate-range ballistic missiles with a striking range of 2200 miles and medium-range ballistic missiles with a striking range of 1020 miles. The CIA estimated that the missiles would probably be operational within a week and, once mounted with nuclear warheads, be capable of inflicting as many as 80 million casualties if launched against major US cities. On 22nd October, the president went on national television to explain the gravity of the threat and outline his quarantine decision to the American people. If any Soviet missiles were launched from Cuban soil against any targets anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, Kennedy emphasized, the US would regard it as an attack by the Soviet Union on the US, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. On 24th October, however, US policymakers breathed a collective sigh of relief when Soviet ships halted short of the quarantine line, averting a feared confrontation. Secretary of State Rusk famously quipped, "Remember when you report this, that eyeball to eyeball, they blinked first." The Cuban Missile Crisis certainly demonstrated, as did the earlier crisis over the Taiwan Strait and Berlin, the centrality of the nuclear imbalance at that stage of the Cold War. Deputy Foreign Minister of USSR Vasily Kuznetsov warned a US diplomat shortly after the missile crisis by saying, "You Americans will never be able to do this to us again." The Vietnam War presents the student of Cold War with a great paradox. By the time of Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, the US had sent 16,000 military advisors to South Vietnam, permitted those advisors to participate in combat operations against Viet Cong insurgents, initiated covert operations against North Vietnam, and significantly deepened its commitment to preserve a non-communist regime in South Vietnam. By the late 1960s, in some cases much earlier, the key allies as Canada, France, Great Britain, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, and Japan openly questioned the relevance of America's costly exertions in Indochina to common Cold War interests and policies. Despite the Vietnam War, the United States and Soviet Union managed to avert another major confrontation throughout the mid and late 1960s, while maintaining at least some of the positive momentum engendered by the post-Cuban Missile Crisis reapproachment. By 1968, the superpowers were actually inching towards a historic agreement on the limitation of strategic arms. The Cold War presented aspiring Third World leaders with a complex range of problems, challenges, and opportunities. This initially became evident during the anti-colonial struggles in early post-war Southeast Asia. In the case of Pakistan, its governing elites pursued an American connection, becoming a formal ally in the mid-1950s through the negotiation of bilateral security agreement with Washington and membership in two multilateral pacts. While India got closer to the USSR on account of ideology and concerns for national security, India's role during Cold War was the one of de-escalating the war and of promoting peace and development not just for itself but for the third world as a whole. India's Prime Minister Nehru warned, once foreign relations go out of our hand into the charge of somebody else, to that extent and in that measure you are not independent. He was convinced that his young nation could maximize its international stature and influence in world councils by assuming the role of a third force in international affairs. A realistic Nehru confided to an aide by saying, even in accepting economic help, it is not a wise policy to put all our eggs in one basket. Sukarno, Nasir, Nkrumah and others would have heartily agreed with that sentiment. While the onset of rising tensions between the Soviet Union and China, punctuated by border clashes between their troops and the serious possibility of actual war between the two communist rivals, provided another incentive to place the Soviet-American relationship on a sounder footing. With his assumption of the presidency in January 1969, Richard Nixon embraced détente with renewed vigor, but at the end of December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded and occupied Afghanistan, sounding détente's final death knell. The late 1980s witnessed the most momentous changes in the overall structure of world politics since the 1940s. In 1982, the newly elected US President Ronald Reagan described the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the modern world. Yuri Andropov, who became the Soviet leader after the death of Brezhnev in November 1982, exclaimed that the Reagan administration was embarking on an extremely dangerous path. For the first time in 15 years, US and Soviet negotiators were no longer even talking to each other in any forum. During the second half of 1983, US-Soviet relation reached the lowest point. In his January 1985 State of the Union address, Reagan proclaimed, "We must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent from Afghanistan to Nicaragua to defy Soviet-supported aggression." Even British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, America's most loyal ally and Europe's most anti-Soviet political leader, was outraged by Reagan's heavy-handedness. A 12th June 1982 demonstration in New York's Central Park drew close to 1 million people in support of a freeze on each of the superpowers' nuclear arsenals. A Gallup poll of December 1983 reported that 47% of Americans believed that the Reagan military buildup had brought the US closer to war rather than closer to peace, whereas only 28% disagreed. In the face of those vigorous protests, the Reagan administration backed off. Shortly after Reagan's resounding re-election in November, Moscow agreed to participate in negotiations under that framework. The accession in March 1985 of Mikhail S. Gorbachev to the position of General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party stands as the most critical turning point in the Cold War's final phase. Gorbachev's concession led to the conclusion of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed at the December 1987 Washington Summit. The INF Treaty, rapidly ratified by the US Senate, led to the destruction of 1,846 Soviet nuclear weapons and 846 US weapons within 3 years. Due to such positive measures, the Berlin Wall, dividing Eastern and Western Germany, came down in November 1989. By the summer of 1990, the Soviets, Americans, British, French, and Germans agreed that the two Germanys would henceforth constitute a single, sovereign country that would remain anchored to the NATO alliance. The main issue was now disappeared. Thus, the year 1990 rather than 1989 truly marked the end of the Cold War. The collapse of the Soviet Union itself in 1991 stands as a critically important historical event in its own right. By the time Soviet Union disappeared, the Cold War itself was already history.